So my contribution is called Apocalypse Then and Now. You could just as well say now and then. They're kind of reversible because the now could have been back in the time of Jesus. That would be a now. And then there would be the then. Or we now can look back and call that a then. And so what I'm really interested in is that sort of fluid idea of two things. One is just as simple as timing. In my paper, I really trace it back to the amazingly influential book of Daniel, which a number of times talks about the appointed time of the end. And once that line, and there's no other text like that in the Hebrew Bible. Isaiah 2, in the last days, or you might as well say someday, right? Someday the mountain of the Lord's house will be established and all the nations will come. You can believe it, but you can wait for it, you can hope for it, but there's not a clock ticking, so to speak. So that's one element, is just timing. When we talk about apocalypse, now and then, you get the temporal, but also what's supposed to happen. And particularly in the book of Daniel, which is centered on the persecutions of Antiochus Epiphanes in the roughly, let's just say 165 BCE, you get these events, but in the visionary chapters, you can actually begin to talk about horns on beasts in chapter 7, different kingdoms that are going to arise that can have a varied interpretation, as they did in the time of Jesus, from the texts that we have, Dead Sea Scrolls, other surviving texts. And what's supposed to happen gets reinterpreted because, frankly, the end didn't come. So if you read Daniel 11, which is the most detailed chapter, you get to a point before verse 40 where you're clearly talking about Antiochus Epiphanes. Nobody doubts that. Conservative, liberal, any interpreter would say, there we are. We're looking back on history. And then you have that fateful phrase, and at the appointed time of the end, the king of the north will do this and the king of the south will do that. And Antiochus didn't do any of that stuff. Read any commentary. They'll say, here the seer breaks off into his own imagination. But the problem is, if it's the word of God, as it was taken to be by rabbis and by Christians, as it was canonized, and then writing upon it is the book of Revelation, which becomes a recapitulation of that book to some large extent with many more details, then it isn't just the seer or the visionary or the author looking forward in some inaccurate way. It actually becomes a prediction of what will happen at the end of the age. Now, in the days of Jesus and in the time of Jesus, and as Greg alluded to, it's disputed whether Jesus himself bought into this. I'll read you a quotation from a contemporary, the historian Josephus. In book 6, after he recounts in his Jewish war, toward the end, it's the last book of the Jewish war, all the horrors of the war and what led up to it and how it could have been avoided, his own place in it and so forth. He says this. It's an amazing passage. But what more than all else incited them to war was an ambiguous oracle likewise found in their holy scriptures. Notice that there, he's Jewish, he's talking about his own people. An ambiguous oracle to the effect that at that time, one from their country would become ruler of the world. They understood this to mean someone of their own race. We would today call it the Jewish Messiah, right? So both Jews and Christians are messianic, apocalyptic eschatologists. And what that means is there's an unfolding hidden scenario of what's going to happen. But essentially, it has to do with messianic times and whether we're in messianic times or approaching messianic times or whatever. So what Josephus says is that the Jews at the time of the Second Revolt, so 40 years after the death of Jesus, they thought, well, the clock has gone right up to midnight. And so at that time is going to come this anointed one, a ruler. And many of their wise men went astray in their interpretation, because the oracle, however, in reality signified the sovereignty of Vespasian, who was to be proclaimed emperor on the Jewish soil. So here's Josephus living in the palace, former palace of Vespasian, around maybe 73 CE, writing the Jewish Wars. And it seems pretty clear that he's reflecting on the prophecy of Daniel, probably the 70 weeks prophecy of Daniel that many Bible readers know well, in which you have a final period of 10 jubilees. The Dead Sea Scrolls pick up on this quite heavily. Much of the New Testament seems to maybe built around it. Paul says in his letter, 1 Corinthians 7, the appointed time has grown very short, using the very language of Daniel. The clock is almost at midnight, that sort of thing. That's prophetic clock. Now, for Jesus followers, the Messiah has already come. So you're actually talking about so-called second appearance, or the parousia of the final judgment. So we're very familiar with that in Christian theology and history. What my paper is about is how the clock finally just either breaks, runs out, or stops. And later in the 19th century, when you take up what we call a kind of Darbyite dispensationalism idea, it actually stops. It stops 7 years before the final period. So now it could be any time. You know, you could go 2,000 years and all of a sudden, oh, we're in the final 7 years again. So we're pretty familiar with that from Hal Lindsey and from all sorts of prophetic things of the 20th century. But during that mid-period, once you get past the Montanists and you get into the 3rd and 4th century, and particularly Augustine, you begin to see that the clock doesn't really matter anymore, because Christ will come when Christ comes. And even though there are speculations, I think every single church father, and maybe the church mothers too, if we could get their writings, many of which have disappeared, many of them have some scheme in mind, whether it's after 400 years or after 1,000 years. Many of you know Cohen's book, The Pursuit of the Millennium, where he traces this kind of speculation that rises in the Middle Ages. But again, it's based on Daniel. 1,290 years, 1,000 years, 1,235 years, 1,260 years. These are all period where a day is taken for a year and so forth. But the big thing that happens is not just the clock not being as important, but an allegorization of the literalness of books like Daniel and Revelation, so that the beast could be the Pope, for example, which was common with Protestants. And now you say, well, is he marching into the Middle East and doing exactly what Daniel 7 says he'll do, or Daniel 11? That's not important anymore. The details aren't important. There's this sort of allegorization of the parameters of prophecy. So the clock, in a sense, is kind of suspended to some degree, where you just don't worry about the clock, particularly post-Enlightenment. I mean, until the 20th century, of course, in the 19th century, there were speculations with Zionism and so forth. But until the 20th century, you basically would talk about, for Christian believers, the Messiah already came, and the church is the kingdom. And yes, all nations are learning about Christ. And so Isaiah 2 and Isaiah 11 are being fulfilled. And there's a spiritualization of Israel itself as being basically Christian believers. So I would call this a kind of suspension of the kind of messianic apocalyptic eschatology that we had in the Second Temple period. It just sort of all failed. And so either it was really fulfilled with Jesus being the Messiah and exalted to heaven, and it all happened, or essentially you kind of give up on it. What the rabbis finally say in Sanhedrin 97, 98, which is one of the tractates of the Babylonian Talmud, is no more calculations. The Messiah will come when he comes, and you remember the famous story. If you're planting a tree and you're in Haifa, and somebody says, the Messiah just arrived, and he's in Jerusalem, finish planting the tree, and then go check it out, maybe on the weekend or whatever, because they're after Sabbatai Tzvi, after all of these movements came and went, people began to just wonder. And then we get to World War II, which we've just heard a different aspect of. But I close my contribution with this wonderful quote from H.H. Rowley. He wrote it in the 40s when we weren't sure who was going to win the war, frankly. Pretty dark days of the war. And The Relevance of Apocalyptic, many of you probably own it. It's one of the classics of apocalyptic studies. And I think I have time. Let me just read this to you. It's just such an amazing quote. Think of it in the time it was written. And here's what the wise Rowley said to all of us. This is a quote from him. Yet where for almost 2,000 years a hope has proved illusory, we should beware of embracing it afresh. These are all the people that said, oh, Hitler's the Antichrist, and he wears out and persecutes the people of God. So he's the new Antiochus Epiphanes. And believe it or not, Rommel is in the South coming up, the king of the South, and Hitler is at Berchtesgaden planning to fly down to Jerusalem when Rommel enters Jerusalem, the king of the North, the king of the South. This is what Rowley's talking about. And the Jewish people are being persecuted. At that time, there will be a time of trouble such as was not from the beginning of the nation, neither will ever be again. Talking about the Jewish people. How could it not be? How could it not be? But Rowley said, be careful. The writers of these books were mistaken in their hopes of imminent deliverance. Their interpreters who believed that consumption was imminent in their day proved mistaken. And they who bring the same principles, notice his language, the same principles and the same hopes afresh to the prophecies of today will prove equally mistaken. Now, those who are Darbyites or dispensationalists or Hal Lindsey types or prophecy buffs even into our day would say, what a cynical statement. And yet I don't think it's cynical at all. I think Darby's saying, don't forget the lessons of history. And, think about what could happen. So what I point out in the article, and this is where Greg said you need another 1,000 words, which we couldn't, of course, have. But once you get to the 19th century, okay, the Jews are going back to the land. It begins to offer you the possibility for reworking a literal scenario, like I just mentioned with Hitler and Rommel. You see, we could actually open your Bible, as prophetic people say today, and read it like your daily newspaper. Christadelphians do this today. They're all over YouTube. Hal Lindsey's book, I think we should all read it. Tim LaHaye's books, Left Behind. But then something else happened. Not just the establishment of the state of Israel in 1948, but the Six-Day War in 1967. So we're living now in the time since 1967, where you can open Matthew 24, Mark 13, Daniel 11, and replay it in the most literal way. And what's important for us to, as historians of religions, to point out is that things were never more set for fulfillment than they were in the late Second Temple, say 100 BCE, all the way down to the destruction of Jerusalem, maybe to the end of that first century, as we call it. I mean, as Norman Perrin used to say, what was most expected to happen didn't happen. The beast is defeated, and the followers of Jesus, or even Jews who didn't believe in Jesus, would triumph over the world. And what they least expected, that Rome began to grow much stronger in the second century and the third century, of course, is the heyday of Roman power. So it's a complete reversal. So that's what my article or contribution is about. It's a cautionary note, a cautionary tale. I am concerned with our own times in that regard. I've noticed Dom Crossan has begun to talk a lot in apocalyptic terms, but he's not interpreting Daniel 11. He's not interpreting Revelation 17 and counting any horns on the beast. If you've listened to him lately, he's extremely passionate about evolution and climate change and how we're about to bring on the apocalypse that we never expected. And it has nothing to do with troop movements in the Middle East. It's a global catastrophe actually brought on by our own foolishness and, to put it bluntly, and he would say this, our own lust for power and our own selfishness, sort of where the chickens come home to roost, so to speak, and we pay our dues. So that's what my contribution's about. It's just reminding us to be careful, because that's an afterlife of Jesus that can be so compelling to people. People give up all they have. They change their whole lives. Look at the Jehovah's Witnesses. Look at the Mormons. Look at the whole dispensationalist movement. I listened to every word on January 6th and also the day before. Way beyond Trump or the attack on the Capitol, which none of us knew was coming. I couldn't believe how many of the speakers on January 5th at the all-day rally, live, I listened to every one of them, were preaching the apocalyptic stuff again. The Zionist, the timetable, everything. I don't think we're out of it. And if anything, it's going to get worse, not better, as we move on into more critical times economically, socially, and as Crossan has reminded us in terms of just global catastrophes. So that's basically what I wanted to say. I did want to hold this up and remind everybody that the German title was not The Quest of the Historical Jesus. This very volume, Von Reimarus zu Rede, from Reimarus, 1770s, to Rede at the turn of the century, 1900s. This is an afterlife of Jesus. Everybody says, oh, no, that's the real quest for the historical Jesus. But if he didn't call it that, if you read it, it's a series of imaginative takes on Jesus, right? From the liberal lives of Jesus to the romanticized lives of Jesus to Schweitzer's own thoroughgoing eschatological view of Jesus. So even the enterprise that I find myself in, and I appreciate this volume so much, I see myself as just still looking in the well of history and seeing my own face. In other words, the afterlives continue. And I think we all have to take that seriously. And isn't that really what all the volumes are about? Finding in Jesus some sort of cipher and encouragement, being shaped by, but also reflecting maybe our own hopes and dreams. So I just took a tiny slice of it in my article. Thank you. the widespread diversity of the element that comes from the Hebrew prophets, justice, righteousness, care for the weak, and so forth, that Jesus exemplifies, particularly in the sayings material, the parables, and so forth. That's been appropriated in many, many ways, and it always becomes a commendable side of an appropriation of an afterlife of Jesus. Whether we're talking about the great, huge examples of St. Francis and Mother Teresa or something like that, but no matter what one thinks of, say, the Catholic Church and all of its evils, or any period of history, just that simple phrase from the book of Acts, and he went about doing good, healing the sick, and helping the oppressed, and so forth, or the poor widow who gives all she has. These are these shining stories that come out in many, many traditions, no matter what their doctrine is. I'm noticing now I take Christianity Today as one of my ways of trying to keep up with what I call high-end evangelical Christianity, which I don't really identify with, but they talk about Matthew 25, the Matthew 25 movement, that judgment really, and it's the same as Amos, Hosea, and all the prophets said, that when you really come down to it, it's being a person for others, sacrificing, that sort of thing. It might seem like a platitude, it might seem a little too obvious, but as Schweitzer himself said, after leaving behind the thoroughgoing eschatology, what do you do with that wheel of history that lunged back and crushed Jesus? Or you put your shoulder to it and try to advance it forward. What was his basic program? Crossan, to me, has done this in such a dominant way with all of his influence, talking about the powers that be, and how, and also Funk and others. I think they understand a Jesus that is worth reappropriating continually in 1,000 ways. Whereas the apocalypticism, it scares me more. I study it. I mean, I was involved in Waco, and the anniversary is next month on April the 19th, 30th anniversary. So it's what I study scares me more than edifies me. But what keeps me a kind of Jesus guy for all these years, rather than studying some other figure, is that compelling nature of that message Burt Mack and others have helped me to see, that is often associated with those early sayings of Jesus that are so compelling.